Hi, my name is Stefan Laxness. I am an architectural researcher and a project coordinator at Forensic Architecture, and I also run a design unit at the Architectural Association called Diploma 9. That's me again. So, Forensic Architecture, for those who do not know, is a research project that assembles a team of architects, filmmakers, activist theorists, and what we do is we undertake research in conflict zones, and the team produces and presents spatial analysis in legal and political forums. The term forensic architecture pre-exists the project that is forensic architecture itself, so it kind of refers to the building surveyor who undertakes careful analysis of structures, establishing the cause of their damage. But there is an origin to the word forensics itself, which comes from the Latin of the word forensis, which means pertaining to the forum. And in this case, we mean the Roman forum that we consider as or it used to be, this sort of multidimensional space of politics, law, and economy. But with the modernization of the word forensics, this critical dimension has somehow been lost in a linguistic drift. The Forensic Architecture project attempts to expand the notion, the term, and turn it back into its original meaning. Therefore, it not only engages in detailed forensic architectural analysis, but also actively seeks the form that this analysis will be dissipated to. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit more in the presentation. In the past, we've done many investigations that have provided evidence for international prosecution teams, political organizations, non-governmental organizations, and the United Nations. One of the things that we tried to do is to attempt an inversion of what we call the forensic gaze from something. So the forensic gaze can be understood as when you think about forensics, CSI, that it's something that's primarily within the hands of the state, so state-driven organizations, and we're trying to shift that away from the state into the hands of citizen-driven organizations, so to reappropriate that forensic practice. Forensics are usually undertaken by the state, so that's what I just said, sorry. But what we try to do is essentially discover new ways for citizens to turn that forensic gaze around to look back at the state. Sorry, I'm just going to retract a little bit, but one thing that's important to the practice that we do is this notion of counter-forensics. We sort of consider it as a creative way to monitor, track, and survey human rights violations through a number of domains. The field, which is where the incident occurs, but also the lab, which is the studio where the evidence is processed. So that is the office of forensic architecture. And that sort of mobilizes our inferiority of evidence, and we managed to turn that data into creative ways. Now, I'm going to go and show you some sort of more standard examples of the work of forensic architecture. So, how do I play this?
Each photograph captures only a small part of the building, but composing and cross-referencing them allows us to reconstruct the architecture of the building and locate the images of the bombing. We locate the photographs with the model. The model then becomes the medium through which we can navigate between the different images and videos of the incidents. There are a number of CCTV cameras in the hospital that are continuously on, capturing every strike. We locate each camera and its orientation in the building. We integrate footage from the CCTV cameras, handheld videos, and photographs to reconstruct the interior spaces. This video, placed within the model, is from the strike on July 16th, 2016. Locating each video clip in space provides a tangible link between them, verifying their place and constructing their relation to each other. We follow the civilians as they move through the targeted building. On the ground floor, there are 4 CCTV cameras, and each captures the consequence of the strikes. This CCTV camera captures one of the corridors leading to an exit from the building. This video of medical staff transporting a wounded person to an ambulance provides an essential link between inside and outside. As they load the wounded person into an ambulance, we can see the disposition of buildings outside, a fact that helps us verify the location of the building.
So I think this finished. Sorry, I forgot to mention to introduce this video. So this was an investigation we did into an M2 hospital in Aleppo that was bombed 14 times. And it's a really good example of some of the work that we do in terms of sourcing visual material and then reconstructing that within a 3D environment in order to establish things like timeline of events, confirm that these events have taken place, measure the amount of destruction, for example. And this has been part of a series of investigations that we've done into multiple airstrikes, mostly in Syria, in the last year and a half. And these videos then get published for advocacy purposes and to often establish accountability into who actually perpetrated these crimes. I'm going to show you another video. This one. So this here is another example, but in this case, it's the example of a mosque in Syria that was bombed by the US. And you'll see, I'll just elaborate on it a little bit afterwards.
We interviewed and exchanged architectural plans with the building's original contractor and caretaker, who was also wounded in the strike. The upper floor, he said, contained the imam's flat. His wife was at home and was killed in the strike. The ground floor contained the main prayer hall in the south, as well as the ritual washing room, the toilets, the kitchen, and the winter prayer hall in the north part. The strike took place just as a religious seminar in the winter prayer hall was finishing up. Some 40 to 50 people were still there. Others were gathering in the main prayer hall in preparation for the night prayer. A video taken during the construction of the building verifies witness testimonies regarding the layout and use of each room.
So, in this example, so while in the M2 hospital, we were sort of sourcing videos online mainly. This one, we actually got into contact with an individual on the ground who could go around and take all these pictures, and through WhatsApp, we essentially figured out the interior of the mosque in order to prove that the mosque that had been bombed by the Americans, which they denied was a mosque, was in fact a mosque. And in both these cases where you have something that we do quite a lot of, which is to use the 3D and the images as a way to weave a cohesive narrative between what might seem to be at first sort of disparate sets of information. That is actually quite important because often one of the things that we deal with today in conflict zones like Syria is deniability. So if Russia bombs a hospital, they deny it. And part of the job here is to actually weave this all together, to be able to answer to this notion of ground truth, which is to be able to say, well, something did happen on the ground. Here's a set of images. Here we can reconstruct it and in fact confirm that this happened. So that is always the first step in the work that we do. And then depending on how far our investigation can go, that can lead to finding sort of the probability of accountability or the full accountability. Another sort of practice that we do with 3D modeling is dealing with the 3D modeling from memory, so the architecture of memory. And the idea here is that in the same way that the buildings in the Syria airstrike investigations, the buildings themselves contain the traces of human rights violations and violence, memory of people that undergo trauma also contains the traces of that violation and of that violence. And that is something that can be incredibly precise, that we reuse in order to recreate spaces based on people's memory, but it can also lead to a fair amount of distortion in the same way that, say, an airstrike might on a building. So this is an excerpt from our project Sidnaya, which was about a Syrian torture prison run by the Assad government. And in this project we had access to former detainees, and we began to rebuild the inside of the prison and the functioning, the day-to-day functioning of the prison based on their memory and having them sort of directly engage with the 3D modeling process.
بصيدنايا كل شيء بأمر، يعني كل شيء بأمر. يعني الصوت الوحيد اللي ممكن أنا كنت ما أتمنى أسمعه إنه استيقاظ. يعني يا ريتني بقدر نام في يوم أطلع أو في يوم موت. فقت الساعة 5:30 6. الصبح في صوت عصافير خفيف، والهواء بالشجر وقت يطلع صوت الهواء مع ورق الشجر. تمام، تكون هواء خفيف. الشمس بتفوت الساعة 1.
ونحن هاي المرحلة شو بنستغلها بشو؟ ضوء قوي كثير، بنخلع ثيابنا وبنقعد بنفلي الأمل لأنه الضوء ببينه. بس من بين الأصوات المهمة، إذا عم تسألوا عن الأصوات، الأمل لما بيطق هيك مثل السمسم لما هيك شو بيعمل صوت هيك.
اللي احنا قلت لك احنا في شبك نقدر نشوف فيه شبابيك، بعد الشبابيك في السماء، احنا بنشوف السماء بس.
بهذا الجناح الشمس يعني قبل المغرب بشوي بتفوت من يعني بتميل ميلانة عند الشبابيك تبع الجناح، بتعكس على المهجع.
ما الشمس عم تمشي على الارض شوي شوي تطلع لبرا شوي 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 شوي، تمام؟ وقت طلعت لبرا بعد فتره صرنا هيك مقدرين الساعه 5:30.
فانه ينفتح هذا الباب الجناح، ينفتح بالليل ويقلنا بس هيك بيقلنا نيام الكل ولا عرصات. فهي احلى صوت ممكن الواحد يسمعه بحياته ننام، لانه انت لما بينام الواحد بصدنايا بيتمنى انه ما يفيق يعني.
I actually was involved in the modeling of this particular bit, and I remember that I was trying to replicate his testimony in the simulation of the model, and it kept coming out completely wrong. And I was thinking, well, they must, it's all distorted, whatever. But actually, then I realized my model had been oriented not towards north, but in some completely other direction. And actually, in fact, he was incredibly precise about how he remembered the particular experience of being in that cell. So these videos were more just, I think they're sort of things that you might be more familiar with from forensic architecture, but I actually want to speak more specifically about a recent project that we did, which was the project about the disappearance of the 43 students in Mexico, otherwise known as the Ayotzinapa case. Who here is familiar with the Ayotzinapa case, or the instance of the disappearance of the students? Okay, there's a few of you. Okay. So this is the reason why I want to talk about it. It's a recent project, but it's also sort of one of the larger projects that we've done. And there was a lot that we've learned from this project. And throughout, I'm going to sort of compare it a little bit to some of the previous projects that we've done. The Ayotzinapa project is very different in terms of its context. Usually we'd been doing a lot of things in the Middle East. This was in North America. The material that we're dealing with, usually we deal with a lot of visual material. In the case of the Ayotzinapa investigation, we had 0 visual material to go by. I think we had like 3 or 4 images. And the format of the final product, and also how the investigation was then diffused and disseminated to the public. So maybe the first thing to do is just to talk about, to give you just sort of a rundown of what happened on that day. I'm going to miss probably very key things because it's an extremely convoluted story. Does this work? So basically, 100 or so students left their rural school down here in Ayotzinapa, and they were trying to head towards Mexico City, which is somewhere up there, in order to commemorate, ironically, the student massacre of 1968 in Tlatelolco. And what they usually do for these commemorations, that they have to commandeer buses, but they've got some agreement going on with the bus companies. And so they commandeer buses, and then they drive up to Mexico City. So what they did is they started commandeering buses, then they drove all the way up, and they stopped right outside this town called Iguala. And they never really intended on going inside the town, but at some point, because of reasons that are a bit complicated, they ended up in the bus terminal of the town. And once they were all there, they were there in about 5 buses, they got a sense that the police was onto them and they were getting a bit nervous, so they split. So the bus station is down there. They split into 2 convoys, where 2 buses went north and 2 buses went east. And in those 2 locations, the 2 convoys were attacked by multiple members of security forces. So local police were definitely some of the perpetrators, but as you'll see in the story, everybody was more or less present in this incident. And from these 2 locations, in each one of them, at least one of the buses had all the students from that bus taken away, put in the back of police cars, and disappeared. And the story goes that those students were then handed over to members of the drug cartels somewhere around there, and then brought sort of further out into another town to a place known as the Kukula dump, which is sort of a local dump where allegedly they were shot and burnt. And then later throughout the night, there was even more violence when a bus with a football team of about, they're all 15 years old, was shot up 20 kilometers south of the city, and even further outside, then a roadblock was created, and actually a number of roadblocks around the town in which other people were shot. So what happened following this incident is that it was such a big scandal. It was one of the few instances where mass disappearance actually got reported on and talked about on an international level, and so the Mexican government was understandably a bit embarrassed. And so they invited the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to come in and help them with the investigation. And what they did is that they put together these people, who we'll refer to as the Independent Group of Experts, to assist the Mexican government with its investigation. During their investigation, they wrote 2 reports, each of about 500 pages. The first report, they were starting to realize that there was a lot of discrepancies with with the investigation of the government. And when they got to their second report, they realized they were about to get kicked out because what they were going to reveal was a bit too embarrassing. So they, in a rush, they sort of wrote this second report, which is also another 500 pages, that sort of highlighted all the sort of issues with the prosecutor's investigation into the case. Maybe just to backtrack a little bit about the story, to give you an example of one of the many levels of sort of discrepancies in the government's case. There were 5 buses. The 5th bus was completely omitted by the government. And then when people came out and said, hey, there was a 5th bus, then they provided a bus that was riddled with bullet holes. But it turned out that bus had never been shot at. So one has to ask, where is the 5th bus, which is still an open question. And what is this bus that they provided that was completely shot up? So that's one of many, many discrepancies. So where we come into this project is we were invited by Centro Pro, which is a human rights group in Mexico City that sort of represents the families of the victims who disappeared that night, and a group called the Equipo Argentino de Antropología Forenses, which stands for the team of Argentinian forensic anthropologists. And they were involved in working with the group of independent experts in terms of providing archaeological forensic report on the burn site in which the students were allegedly burned. And they spent a year essentially debunking that claim completely. So they invited us to do a project. So this is sort of what they do. And when we sort of came into this, we didn't really know what to think, and as we usually do, we need to sort of sit down, look at a bunch of material, and start to conceptualize a project. But what we realized very quickly is that, so the case was highly complex as an incident, as you'll find out later on. It was a very large-scale event, and often we deal with, you know, airstrike is a bit of a punctual event, even though it exists within a larger context, but this is over many hours, and as you'll find out, it had a lot of people involved. But we realized after going to Mexico City to meet the families of the victims, and also, you know, I have friends in Mexico City, so we sort of got a sample from all these different echelons of Mexican society, that the public discussion around the incident always revolved about where the disappeared students were, but actually there was very little clarity regarding the events that led up to the actual disappearance. And something that we noticed as well is that within the news, within media articles, that the official narrative, which is that the students arrived in this town to cause disruption, got attacked by rogue police, and then were disappeared, kept getting sort of repeated and reused, and it was sort of like a little forward to almost every article, but it was really sort of reductive and misleading in terms of the actual event itself. Then, once again, I'll mention the lack of visual material, which is quite important because that's something that we rely on quite heavily. And when you think about it, you know, the government, like I talked about forensics earlier, the government has sort of the loudest microphone to diffuse whatever message it wants to diffuse. So this reductive message was being perpetrated pretty much everywhere. And so the question that we had is, well, it seemed to be that there was a need in Mexico to communicate a new narrative that was more aligned with that of the victims of the events that happened that night, and that there was a genuine sort of issue with how can we start to communicate an event so complex to a large swath of Mexican society when the government's version is so sort of neat and snappy and, you know, can fit easily within an article. So that sort of became our challenge. Now, the lack of primary evidence was a bit of a problem, because primary evidence, like the visual material, is often the keyhole that leads us into a project that then allows us to expand onto the broader context. And when we talk about visual material, there's also this idea of forensic aesthetics. And forensic aesthetics has to do with how the buildings, how the media, how the images how that violence gets registered into those things. And when we have none of that to work on, it sort of becomes a bit of an open question as to how we actually have to work in this. So what we realize is these two reports that the group of experts wrote actually seem to us to be the most exhaustive sort of coverage of the actual events, and it combines all the testimonies, reports, and all kinds of things. The only problem is that they're, like I said, each 500 pages, and nobody's got time to read 1,000 pages worth of reports. The families of the victims, like half of them, I think, are illiterate. So, and even you in your free time probably don't have the time to do it. So essentially what we set out to do was to take these two reports and to use them as our primary evidence, because we noticed that as we were reading them, there was some pretty shocking stuff, but because of the way the documents were written in chapters and everything, all of these different issues were being compartmentalized in like a contents page, but we had a hunch that essentially if you started to map out these elements and started to visualize them, you would start to get a spatialization of this event. And then maybe we could start to produce this new narrative for this event. So what we set out to do is to data mine these two reports. And what data mining is essentially just going through this sentence by sentence and breaking it down into about 5,000 bits of rows of information in which each idea, thought, concept, sentence gets broken down into this sort of spreadsheet in which we tag it, we locate the time, we say who's speaking, we say, for example, if they say student A noticed federal police and he was in bus this, well, we note all those things down, we put them in this giant spreadsheet. And that essentially, these points or these rows of information essentially then become data points that can be mapped and timed on a map. And from these 5,000 points, we produce what we call the Ayotzinapa platform, which is a digital platform for exploring the Ayotzinapa case. In this platform, this is sort of what the interface looks like. It's very complicated. It's not for everybody. Not everybody spends their life on Photoshop and After Effects, so I can understand that it's not easy. But essentially what you get is this cartographic platform in which to visualize the case in space and time. And the idea is that people interested in it, journalists, citizens, can start to use this platform as a way to find their own patterns and relationships within the case. So you have your map environment, you have your timeline, and the data points appear in both of them. Then you have your tags that you can turn on and off, and there are a lot of tags. There's about 600 tags, and it goes from things as general as police to individual names of people. So it actually becomes really good as a platform to narrow down to very specific things. So instead of reading 1,000 pages, you can just click on something. The platform also contains 3D reconstructions of some of the main crime scenes in the case. And these I'll sort of explain later, but these were built up from all the reading and all the data mining and all the sort of getting to know and becoming specialist in the material that we had to do. And there's a number of these. And then these are also, we sort of broke them down into phases so that people can start to understand the phases of these different attacks, but also having sort of the number of vehicles there starts to quantify the scale of the event. So when people say rogue policemen, well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a lot of policemen going on there. And that grows and grows and grows and grows. The platform also has a set of video reports. The video reports were designed, in this case, as final products, but essentially as tools to better understand the platform and to better understand the case. Because if you go into the digital platform and you know nothing about the case, you're lost. But the videos, we transform them into essentially tools to understanding the platform, but also to familiarize yourself with the case. So I have an example of a tutorial video that we produced. So we created these tutorial videos that taught people how to use it, but in each one of them, we wanted to tell them, well, this is how you can explore a particular theme. So this one here in particular has to do with exploring issues of collusion, coordination, and most specifically the military.
La plataforma Ayotzinapa es una herramienta cartográfica, diseñada para visualizar los eventos que tuvieron lugar en Iguala, Guerrero, la noche del 26 y 27 de septiembre de 2014. En este video, demostramos cómo usar la plataforma para explorar el rol que jugó el ejército. Para navegar a través de los testimonios dados por los militares, dé clic en la sección Personas y abra la pestaña Por testimonio. En el grupo Fuerzas de Seguridad, seleccione la casilla Ejército. Los eventos seleccionados se mostrarán como círculos verdes. En el mapa, podemos ver cómo los eventos relacionados con los militares siguen de cerca las rutas que tomaron los autobuses de los estudiantes, además de la gran cantidad de eventos asociados con la presencia militar en las escenas del crimen más relevantes. En la línea de tiempo, podemos ver cómo el ejército estuvo activo mientras se desarrollaban todos los eventos. Los más altos niveles de actividad también son visibles antes de los ataques, desde la hora en que los estudiantes salieron de la normal de Ayotzinapa, alrededor de las 17:30 horas. Active el botón de comunicaciones para ver las llamadas, reportes y otras comunicaciones entre los miembros del ejército. Claramente emerge un patrón, en el que los militares enviaron información directamente de las escenas del crimen al cuartel del Batallón 27. El ejército también usó el Sistema Centralizado de Comunicaciones C4, a través del cual otras agencias de seguridad intercambiaban información sobre el ataque. Vaya a la pestaña Por mención, despliegue el grupo Fuerzas de Seguridad y dé clic sobre Ejército. Esta información representa los eventos en los que los militares fueron mencionados por otras personas. Explore estos puntos para encontrar información que los militares omitieron sobre los eventos de esa noche. Para investigar miembros del ejército en particular, deseleccione el grupo actual de Ejército o dé clic al botón de Reset. En la pestaña de Por testimonio, en el grupo Ejército, desplace el cursor hacia abajo y escoja uno de los individuos de la lista. El agente de inteligencia militar OBI 1EM estuvo presente en la escena del Palacio de Justicia durante el ataque en ese lugar. Sus comunicaciones registran que estuvo en constante comunicación con el cuartel del ejército en Iguala, reportando la violencia contra los estudiantes. Encuentre al agente OBI-EM en la sección Por mención para ver dónde más fue mencionado. Finalmente, vaya a la sección Escenas y explore los modelos en 3D para observar cómo fue que los militares estuvieron presentes en los episodios finales de cada una de las escenas del crimen. La plataforma Ayotzinapa revela cómo el ejército monitoreó activamente a los estudiantes antes, durante y después de los ataques. A pesar de estar completamente al tanto de la violencia contra los normalistas y de estar presente durante los ataques, no tomó acción alguna para ayudarlos.
Right. So I think that video for me is a really good overview of a really important aspect to the case, which is the involvement of the military, which is something that's hotly debated, but in Mexico, but also sort of under talked about at the same time in certain circles, and a good example of how the platform can be used in order to reach results like that. Usually when we do projects and we have clear visual material like an airstrike or a migrant boat tipping over in the Mediterranean Sea, these things then are these are the images or the representation of the crime itself onto which we overlay our investigation. But in cases like the Ayotzinapa case, and here I'm going to compare it to the recent case called the NSU investigation, we have projects in which we do not actually have access to that material. So what we have to do is reenactment. So in a sense, the Ayotzinapa platform becomes sort of a cartographic reenactment of the crimes that happened that night. Here in this case, in the NSU complex, so the NSU complex was about the how would you say it, the murder of a Turkish internet shop worker by a member of the neo-Nazi group NSU. But during the murder, there was also what's his name? He is an intelligence agent who was there, and he claimed he didn't see or hear anything. But what this case does is essentially question the level of collusion and integration of neo-Nazi groups within sort of the informant network of the German intelligence forces. And so here, in this case, what we did is we reenacted the reenactment of the Secret Service guy of the case. And so when we do a reenactment like that, we're able to use it as a way to test out sort of positives and negatives within an investigation. That means sort of proof that something happened and to disprove that something did happen. And the idea is that the Ayotzinapa platform, although I'm not showing you exactly how this can be done, the idea is that you as an individual can explore the platform and go find this out for yourself. But in both cases, between the platform and the model, these devices become sort of operative spaces in which to test out, one, your investigation, but also test out the sort of testimonies of others, the narratives of others, the versions of others. So that's another photo of us doing the reenactment of the reenactment. The Ayotzinapa platform is also similar to the Rafa project. So this is a project that we developed 2 years ago about this particular day of bombing of Rafah, which is an area in the Gaza Strip by Israeli forces in 2014. And in this project, we developed something called the image complex. So here in this project, we had access to thousands of images that we had to start to make sense of. And so what we did is essentially create a model in which we started to place the images according to where the photograph is, and then to time those images within the model in order to set up a cohesive timeline to the day. Once we were able to do that, then we were able to bring on a new set of determinations. And in this particular case, we looked at one particular airstrike, which involved 2 one-ton bombs in a highly dense residential area. And because of all the work that we did in terms of the timing and the locating, we were able to say, well, yes, this did in fact happen, and did in fact happen in this area. It happened at this time. But also, more specifically, because we can place and scale it within the model, we can also measure the size of the bombs that we can see in the frame of the image. I will show you a video. And those bombs turned out to be a gross example of disproportionate use of force in a civilian neighborhood. This is the Tanur video. I think there's an overlay in the... Can I? Oh, okay. Is there sound? Okay. This is us timing all the different smoke plumes that we saw, and then we use the visual appearance of the smoke plumes in order to find some sort of watermark within them, because if they're caught from different angles, we can start to identify aspects of the smoke plume that we can start to say, well, this is actually the same one, and we can start to time them according to each other. We can begin to place them in space and do the image complex. So that is an example of that as a methodology. Once that's placed and timed, we can freeze frame. We observe the munition being placed there, arriving in the frame. But because we've scaled them, then we can sort of extrapolate what the size of those are. And then we went and did a bunch of research into Israeli munitions, because they publish a lot of this stuff online, and we're able to find the actual model and to, by measuring the crater size, the blast impact, make that determination. And the outcome of this project, one, that determination of disproportionate use of force, but most importantly, it was part of a broader project that was looking at that conflict in which we realized that this this particular operation that was happening that day had to do with the rescue of an Israeli soldier in Gaza, and they were essentially willing to go through this length in order to undermine the tunnels in Gaza and find that particular soldier. Yeah. So now I just wanted to go into sort of the nitty-gritty of actually how sort of one manages large amounts of information from these sort of data reports. So while there's a fairly data side to it, and it sounds like we did everything on a computer with a bunch of algorithms, it's actually not. It's actually really, really tedious. And one of the ways we started doing this is we needed to start refining all the material that we had, because when you start the process, you know nothing about the actual reports, but the further you go in, the more and more you know about it. So we started to come up with all these graphic ways in which to understand the data. And so in this case, we would align the data points into timelines in order to see when sort of things were happening. So when you'd end up with a lot of data points, you could tell, well, actually, this is a flashpoint for things that are happening. So that was one way. Then we would then break these sort of timescales into bits, and we would start to treat the project a bit, sort of compartmentalize it by sort of doing like, well, we're going to do this by crime scene. We're going to analyze everything more specifically in sort of blocks. And we would then take these data points that we arrange in time, rearrange them in space. And then because we have them in time and space, then we started to do these sort of micro diagrams that are almost minute by minute, in which we would sort of diagrammatically represent sort of the locations of every actor that's ever been mentioned in any bit of the testimony that pertains to that minute. Those are example of 3, but then there was like this, but then there was way more. Anyway, it was very, very tedious. And then this then eventually led to the creation of these 3D models. And these 3D models were really important in terms of communicating the scale of the incident. And once again, when the official narrative that's being perpetrated is that there were 2 or 3 rogue policemen that kidnapped the student, what these models show you is that essentially there is a systemic involvement of every layer of law enforcement within that town. So if I can listen, because they have a lot of them in there, they have the local police from 3 different municipalities, the state police, the federal police, the civil protection, and the military. Then we also, I don't know if you can see that, but that's the beginnings of a diagram connecting loads of different people, which was incredibly confusing. But here's something that is actually really important to the project. At some point, we had to start understanding and refining the material that related to the alleged members of organized crime. So that's what we understand often as the cartels. And one of the things that we noticed with the cartels, as opposed to the crime scenes where the victims were, so the ones where the models are where the victims got attacked, the victims tend to be telling the truth. But the cartels, or these guys anyway, we noticed that in their testimony they were often very sort of, they would never really talk about where they were. They were always talking about where somebody else was. So we started plotting their narratives in time and space. So this is sort of a time-space matrix. And we started to realize the more you plot them, the more they don't align at all. And essentially, if everybody's telling the truth, everybody's narrative might start somewhere and they would all converge in one direction. But here what you started to see was actually complete divergence. And it sort of suddenly dawned on us that that diversion is essentially the image of what forced disappearance looks like. That is the diversity of testimonies that allows for the tarnishing of the truth in an event like this. So I need to speed through, but I'm just gonna. So what sort of emerged from this project? So one was the space-time dimension of the violence. Sorry, where am I? So the sheer scale of the event. So here you can see there was 5,000 individual incidents, 266 tags, 93 students, 280 different mentions of other actors. I mean, there's a lot of people. Anyway, but also that there was a spatial dimension to the violence. We noticed that the more you move out from the epicenter of the town, the more the violence started to increase and become more indiscriminate. Also, when looking at the narratives, so if I showed you the narratives there earlier of the cartels, at some point when we were testing out the platform, we wanted to see if we could plot the narratives directly on the map. And this is what we ended up with. And this is not the movements of people, it's where people were in time and space. And what you start to notice, which is something that we thought was quite interesting, is that there's a spatialization of the violence within the town. So in this part here is where you have all the government institution, and this is where all the violence is essentially happening. And that the only place where there's a projection of the violence in terms of burning and killing the students that are disappeared happens around here. But really, I mean, it looks like there's stuff, but actually there was very little link between this part of town and that part of town. And that led us to suggest that there's the projection of violence through false testimony was happening also at a spatial level. Then finally, the coordinated dimension of the violence. Can we play the scale and escalation video? I'm just going to talk over it. Sorry, a bit stressed on time here. There's no sound either. Okay. So that night, not only did all levels of government forces either participate in the violence, either by direct action or through omission, but that also, through the hundreds of communications that they were doing through a centralized communication system, they were essentially all the sort of infrastructure in the town used to keep citizens safe was being used against the citizens. And that was something that we tried to communicate. This is a video that essentially summarizes all the known events of violence leading up to the disappearance of the students. And this is actually a very important document because such a document had actually never been produced in a way that it was clear and communicable for something this complex. And the reason why we stopped at known instances of violence and didn't extrapolate on the whereabouts of the students is because essentially the last certain thing is that the students were put in the back of police vehicles. Beyond that, it's speculation. And the testimonies, the divergent testimonies of the cartel members who allegedly carried that out sort of proves that point. Now, I'm just going to skip. Also, another aspect that was really important was how did you start to describe... sorry, can we put this one back on? How did you start to actually describe forced disappearance? And forced disappearance, unlike an airstrike, which is a punctual event, forced disappearance is a prolonged event in time. And we started to realize that not only is it first the act of taking bodies or violence against bodies, but then the second phase becomes the violence against evidence. And that's something that we really wanted to communicate in this project. And one of the things that, while we didn't have any visual material, there were all these instances of material being omitted or taken out of the prosecutor's case. And so what we wanted to do was to show how, by looking at people's testimony and what they said,
Estuvo presente durante el ataque al autobús Estrella de Oro.
We could actually show that if that material had been present, this is the crucial elements that it would have been able to see.
1531 y la evacuación forzada del autobús Estrella Roja. Fue este mismo agente el que tomó, con su teléfono móvil, la única evidencia fotográfica disponible de la escena del crimen del Palacio de Justicia. Forensic Architecture usó estas fotografías para reconstruir la escena, localizando las patrullas fotografiadas en un modelo 3D. La colocación de estas patrullas coincide con los testimonios de otros policías, como Alejandro Andrade, quien declaró que estacionó la patrulla 28 diagonalmente. Además, la reconstrucción espacial de la escena fotográfica nos permite situar al agente militar 120 metros al oeste del puente bajo el cual se atacó al camión Estrella de Oro 1531.
Military agent was there, never mentions this fifth bus, yet through the one picture that's been provided, we're able to locate him and say, well, actually he was 10 meters away. If he had just looked this way, he would have seen that bus. And that in itself constitutes what we consider to be violence against evidence. This is a good example as well. This is photocopies of the investigation when it gets submitted to the prosecutor's office. So this is photocopies. So there's a law that mandates that things need to be photocopied in paper, in color, but that still doesn't happen. So when the prosecutor's office gets shown pictures like this, and that's an erasure through administration. There was another video that sort of pertains to that, and then just maybe the last one that I'm going to show, and then you guys can maybe ask me about sort of the forum aspect of all this afterwards.
Forced disappearance includes both the destruction of bodies as well as the destruction of evidence. In the Ayotzinapa case, forced disappearance is manifested through the language of false narratives. We have plotted the multiple accounts of the events of the night of the 26th to 27th of September 2014 on a time-space matrix in order to identify moments of collusion and the persistence of contradictory narratives that work to prevent the resolution of this case. The horizontal axis indicates time, starting from 1300 hours on the 26th of September. On the vertical axis, we
Is there no way of skipping through this? Like to move in time? Because we don't actually need to see the introduction.
plotted, from east to west, the locations in and around Iguala where incidents took place. With a black line, we drew the versions of the events as officially presented by the Attorney General of Mexico, the Procurador General de la República, or PGR, which he called the historic truth. This version is still the one presented before the Mexican judges in the ongoing case. According to the PGR's so-called historic truth, at 1300 hours, the students were already at the outskirts of Iguala, in Caseta de Iguala and Rancho del Cura, trying to commandeer buses. Between 1900 and 2000 hours, they regrouped at the Iguala bus terminal. At 2045, as they were leaving the terminal, they were attacked by the Iguala local police.
Basically, this video,
The students proceeded to drive to the junction of Juan Alvarez Street.
The mapping of the narratives was something that was incredibly useful for us to understand the case, but there was no way for us to communicate all these things like scale, collusion, coordination, cartels diverging. What we wanted to do then is to create this video in which we actually map the entire case out in this sort of space-time diagram. And what we started by doing is in black, mapping the narrative of the government, then in red, mapping the narrative of the victims. And the first thing that became apparent is that they diverge completely. But then more importantly, when you map the cartels appear in a completely different sort of space-time area and have actually no connection down with the victims. But the most shocking thing that came out of this drawing, that if you watch it is sort of communicates it much more clearly than me sort of speaking here, is that the official version converges towards the versions of members of alleged organized crime, but more specifically, ones with which the testimonies were obtained through torture. So that obviously puts a lot of doubt into the version as put out by the government, but also this sort of this diagram, animated diagram, but also later we actually produced it as a mural, was able to communicate to an audience the fact that the disappearances happened at the same time in two different locations, that there were multiple attacks, that there were multiple communications, that there is this divergence from the testimony of the victims. And finally, I'm going to skip through a few of these things, but we then brought this to, once we finished the project, we held a big press conference in which we invited both sort of what you'd consider independent media, but also sort of mainstream Mexican media, but also human rights organizations and the art world in Mexico City in order to release the projects. And that was having a good media strategy in order to disseminate these videos and to disseminate the platform is just as important as producing a piece of video investigation that is sort of comprehensive. But then we did that, and that was sort of widely diffused, and it did sort of have the expected effect of starting or regenerating a conversation about the actual events that happened on that night. But it just so happened that we also had an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Mexico City, in which we showcased the project as well. And we produced that diagram as a mural, and we trained a bunch of students from the university to understand the story and to be able to deliver that story to other people. And it was accompanied by the videos as well. And this brought a whole new reach to the project, because then it was not only people sharing it online, but it was also the vast sort of reach of people that this museum in particular sort of attracts. And so suddenly you have this sort of, how would you say, collapse of both the human rights world and the art world around this exhibition, which is something that in Mexico, as the way I understand it, is these things tend to be a bit more separate. And I think that's something, I mean, I would have talked about it a bit more, but I think that's something that's very important about these projects, is that you need to have multiple levels of entry. The platform in itself, even though all the energy, 75% of the energy went into producing that, the platform itself is complicated and not at the reach of most people. But on the other hand, the other entry point then becomes the videos, which are easily shareable. And if the videos can communicate complexity in a simple way and in a way that people sort of latch onto, because one of the videos is 18 minutes, and that's fairly long for anybody. And then on top of that, you have the museum dimension, which the museum we consider as sort of a new successful forum in which to disseminate our work, particularly our work when it pertains to counterforensics, because if we say that the state has the forensic gaze, the state also has the means of control over the forms of diffusion. So the art institution becomes a very successful place for this sort of thing. I'm happy to answer more questions, and thank you.
I'd just like to say, I suppose from a personal point of view, I just feel really humbled by your commitment to honesty, across the whole process as an organisation, but as a person and in the way you presented it. And I guess to be fair to the lives of the people that you were describing, we need to take the time that needs to be taken to describe it, not just here, but within the various different forums. So I'm just really grateful that you and others are committed to this process, so that the accountability and the closure for people, can kind of come, but the honesty of systems can be made manifest. I know it's 1 o'clock, and I know that food is ready, so I'm going to open it to the floor for a few questions. I would definitely invite you to nail this guy. Sorry, go and meet him with a sandwich. It's probably a bad way of looking at it. But we've got an extraordinary amount of intelligence in this person, and a huge capability, and an invitation to share. So I'd really commend engaging with Stefan. So, any questions, please?
I've actually got 3 questions. How long did that project take you? I'll just ask the 3 and then you can answer.
1 year. Okay.
How long did the project take, and can you speculate why such a huge amount of resources were used by the Mexican government to get rid of pesky students? And third, have you actually ever been employed by the other side, such as say the Americans, to prove that it wasn't a mosque?
So the project took a year. It was one of the longer projects that we've done. To your second question, which is why the Mexican government would do this. So that is an open question to this day, and there's a lot of theories as to why that happened. I'm not going to speak on behalf of any of the groups that we worked for, or even the office, about what happened. But me personally, I think there's a lot of these times it's sort of a mixture of just systemic corruption and escalation, but then also followed by a lot of incompetence in terms of the actual legal process that follows it, and all these things sort of compound together to create the situation that we have now. But that's that's my speculation. That is not the view of the office. But there's a lot of theories that I encourage you to read about as to why this actually happened, and some of them are interesting, some less. But yeah. Oh, sorry. I forgot. Yeah, the other side. No, we do not. We do not work with governments. Because governments just in general tend to have an agenda, and I mean, everybody has an agenda, but usually the cases, the investigations that we do have to do with investigating governments or doing counter investigations of governments. I mean, if this case was a case of, for example, criminal organizations doing crimes, it's not the same as the state actually doing the crime but then covering up the crime. Yeah.
This last point might slightly relate to this question. I think this question, I had it for everybody that spoke rather than just you, but it's kind of a broad one. I find myself thinking when you're all speaking about the question, what sustains you? You know, when you're doing this work, what do you go back to keep going?
Like,
I mean, that's what I'm saying is broad.
all right.
It could be like, you could answer that going, okay, what keeps the bills paid, or it could be what motivates me. It could be, you know what I mean? It's
yeah.
to be kind of on the edge where the three you kind of are.
Yeah, I mean,
I wonder what keeps you there.
I think there's multiple levels. Some are fairly basic, but some are much higher and loftier. But I think the one, you know, accountability, justice, and truth, like these are all things that are very important. But I think also in the case of this project and a lot of the ones that we do now, I think are particularly relevant in terms of actually claiming this notion of truth. Because it's something that's fairly contested these days, and everybody is sort of claiming and carving out what their own truth is. And to be able to sort of claim that back and put it to good use, or to good use, maybe that's not a good term, but to put it to a different use, I think is something that is quite important. But also, I think, how do you communicate complexity in an era in which, you know, how events are described tend to be reduced to a dialectics between sort of good and evil and things like that. Being able to communicate this, you know, this singular event, but then also the broader context is something that is very important. But also to be able to sort of, you know, bring this project to, you know, the like in the case of Sidnaya, the actual detainees, the former detainees, to give them a voice in this, here in this case, to give those that have been victimized by the system a new voice in order to actually start to share that one and have a different conversation. Those are things that are very sort of important. Then also as an architect and things like that, there's a bunch of technical things that are, you know, interesting in terms of developing methodologies and everything. But I think those earlier ones that I mentioned are probably the most sort of important.
Okay, a question here and here. So one here and gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for a really compelling presentation and extraordinary work. My question sort of echoes a little bit from the very first conversation of the day, and it's been an extraordinary morning, which is around this question of influence. And with this extraordinary detailed work and a strong evidential base that you create, I suppose I'm wondering to what extent and how much of your work is also about creating the channels for influence, if you like, for actually getting disturbing, creating perturbations that actually disrupt and unsettle the dominant narrative that you're speaking of. And I suppose it's a question around efficacy, and to what extent do the organizations that you work with support that journey, if you like, from the work that goes into the Museum of the Contemporary Art in Mexico, but also lands somewhere where it really needs to land in terms of the political sphere. I'm curious about how you affect and channel the information into a broader macro political sphere in order to affect change or to actually get that message across?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary focus is the political, to bring that into sort of the political sphere and the sphere of a public discussion. Exhibitions tend to be a rarer event than sharing and posting things online. So those are definitely more important. But the aim obviously is to cause some form of change. Now, we obviously are honest with ourselves. We know that this doesn't end mass disappearance in Mexico. The airstrike projects don't end the war in Syria. But sometimes these things, well, one, there's the idea of how it changes the public debate, but then accountability can create a sort of, indirectly, somehow, a response. And that response can lead to a change in behavior or policy by perpetrators. So, for example, the Sydney prison was published in parallel to an amnesty report. That amnesty report got a response from Bashar al-Assad, where he called everybody a spy and whatever. But that response is already something. Whether he saw the actual R thing, who knows? But, for example, the Al Jina Mosque project, that project was a reactive project. So it was a project in which the event happened, the US government put out a statement, then we reacted to that statement, published our investigation, and actually throughout the dissemination of our investigation, the State Department, if that's what it's called, I can't remember, would change its story. So sometimes actually that change happens much quicker than we think. The Mexico case, for example, had one was sort of widely disseminated in Mexico, but a Supreme Court judge did go to the exhibition, did write an op-ed about it. Whether that actually will change anything, who knows? But what we know is that the op-ed was positive, and one can hope that somehow that does sort of change how people in power might think about it. But I think it's more also, the more you put out these investigations out there, the more people might realize that because there is a ubiquity of sort of media production by average citizens, so when the state looks at you, you can actually look back at them, and that these reports are more likely to come out more and more. And I think that's also something that's quite important, is that sort of, yeah.
Brilliant. And gentleman, just look.
Hi. My question is actually for Tara Kennedy. As curator of the talks this morning, we've heard some really interesting speakers, but I'm hearing different things about the use of data and information with Stefan in a very forensic way, but also from Hannah earlier on, from personal histories and story, listening to people talk. But I was quite taken with her first point about her father crossing the threshold, and that there's some sort of, and you know, as practitioners, whether we're architects or planners or other creative types, are we leaving duty of care for all these histories behind the door? Because it will be filled by other voices, and there's never a void. So should be, you know, and I think it was Dermot, yeah. You talked about the sort of fundamental call to arms and some sort of lacking of a democratic kind of architecture, I suppose we might call it. And with Lilith, I was kind of just thought, I sort of made a connection between the project that Tara's doing in Athenry as part of the Free Market, which is a small market town in Galway, where I'm from. And the community there took to the streets in protest at the planning decision to pull the Apple data center, which is going to be one of the largest data centers in Europe, if not the world. And it's sort of, the narrative will be filled because the politicians think it's going to supply jobs and whatever, or the big data people say, well, this is going to be great for your community. But is that because the duty of care that we, you know, as a profession, we're not carrying that in that conversation? So I don't know what the question is in that, but I don't know if that's something that's going to be explored with the project in Venice. I don't know.
in how we make sure to keep asking ourselves these questions, and how that should be really fundamental and core to what it is that we do. And I suppose the ways that you can do that are through opening up that conversation in terms of teaching and it being there right from the beginning of learning, but also that it's really, really fundamental to what should be the professional conversation. So I think duty of care, as you put it, is quite a nice way to put it, I think, and that should be to the forefront of the conversations that we're having. And I suppose it's important, I think, to the way that we have discussed and described and developed the conversation for today, is that it's not about these things being kind of peripheral or something that you can take as an edge condition in terms of practice, but that this idea of questioning ourselves has to be really fundamental and core. So I suppose your question for everybody that we might come back to maybe on the panel discussion as well about what sustains you to do this type of work. I suppose it's that there are many differing answers to the question. There are many differing answers to that question of what sustains you, and there's no right or wrong answer, but that what's important is that we continue to question and have this duty of care. So
okay. Sorry, there's a question at the back. So yeah, see you now. Go on in. Okay, here, go ahead. Right, don't speak yet.
So it's just a question, because I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've been really. So I want to ask Stefan: this is about? I wonder, could you articulate something about the importance of the fact that your work still resides inside architectural drawing, or culture, or production? Because I find that very interesting. You know, that it has gone to a new place, it's gone to a new frontier, but I've been thinking about this for a while. It is not in gaming solely, or in forensics solely, or in anthropology solely. And and even when Eyal has been writing, he's always been writing from our culture, if you like. I speak as an architect. And yet you're on a new frontier, and an architecture, you know, is stuck in its stuff, but you're managing to open new ground, but using fairly simple tools in architecture as well. So it's an open wondering question.
I think probably the reason why it sort of resides still quite a lot in the language of architecture is, one, because the language of architecture is a bit hard to shed, but it's also really easy to expand. Very easy to expand it, in the sense that, you know, you can draw houses and buildings, but then you can also, you know, track motions on a video. You can start to bring in environmental factors. There are all these other languages of drawing that we bring into architecture on a regular basis that can continuously be fed into this. And because it's something that's visual and spatial at the same time, it's also something that I think is a lot easier to somehow expand to others, in the same way that, you know, other people that are not architects are already sort of used to that language indirectly through, I don't know, the first things that can come in mind is things like pop culture. I mean, you know, you go and you see an animation, you play a video game, and somehow that language is kind of pervasive, and it's easy to sort of to expand outwards rather than shed, in a sense. And maybe there's an element of that in it.
Sort of seemingly architectural things that developed in, let's say, in the last 15 to 20 years, like open source mapping, like, even infographics, the use of infographics. And obviously your work doesn't use those tools, because they stop, that you can't get beyond them. They sort of end up on the surface of things. They're more about communicating given ideas rather than I don't know.
No, because I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, the infographics might quantify something, but the work that we do engages with that sort of study of the traces left behind, and you need to sort of overlay that onto an abstraction, and you need to be able to move between those bits of evidence somehow in space to show them. And so it's really hard to actually get out of that sphere, because it's not about quantification. It's
Yeah.
more about
It's more about exploring, and so it's
Exploring,
more
yeah.
like traditional drawing then.
is it more like traditional drawing?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, because
In a
you're
sense.
drawing to find something. You don't know what you're drawing or where you're going, perhaps, but you've
No,
up to
but
a hunch.
I mean, in a sense, you could say that it's the constant sort of exploration of a broader utility toolkit that is of sort of the software that we now have, and also some of the open source stuff and all that. But that is more feeding in rather than architecture sort of feeding out. Maybe that's the way of looking at it.
So I'm gonna pull the chair's prerogative here because I'm getting waved at with a very beautifully designed piece of paper to say stop. So thanks, Rebecca. It's very nice actually. So we have to stop, right? And go and eat. Go carry on this chat with Stefan and others. Before we go, could I just extend a huge thanks to Hannah, Lilette, and to Stefan for a great morning.